Capital Queers, Alex Reynolds Mystery. Book 3. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1999. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 7. We spent the remainder of our waking hours practicing vivisection on the bag full of dolls. Our progress was greatly hampered by not knowing what the hell we were looking for. On the dolls that sported clothes, we stripped off the gowns and underthings, something I was only able to do after Mother assured me that the dolls would not be anatomically correct, and searched the hems and linings and everywhere else we thought an object might be hidden. We found nothing. Then we carefully took the heads and limbs off the dolls and examined their interiors. We also peered inside the torsos and felt around their outsides for suspicious lumps. "I feel like I'm performing a breast examination," said Mother at one point. 3 hours later, we replaced the bag and went to bed, sadder and no wiser. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched Peter strip down to his khaki shorts. He's one of those rare men who look beautiful both in and out of their clothes. We climbed into bed, wrapped our arms around each other, and tried to get to sleep. It turned out to be very difficult. My mind was filled with the forlorn look Ryan had worn at the loss of Mason. I laid my arm across Peter's chest, and as I felt the familiar warmth, a wave of fear washed over me at the idea of what it would be like if he wasn't there anymore. Honey," I whispered. "Are you awake?" "Yeah. I was just thinking." "I know." I propped myself up on my elbow. "How do you know?" "Because I was thinking the same thing." "Oh, really?" I said, smiling in the darkness. "And how do you know that you were thinking the same thing I was?" He reached over and pushed the hair back off my forehead. "I just know," he sighed deeply. "We should try not to think about it." "How?" "By trying not to think at all." As he said this, he drew my face to his, and our lips came together. I met the familiar wet roughness of his tongue, and I realized how smart my husband was. I had already forgotten what I'd been thinking about. There's something about losing yourself in someone you've given your life to that makes you realize you never really lost. As we continued to kiss, Peter's left hand trailed slowly down my chest and stomach and into my shorts, and 7 years together, I'm still excited just by his touch. Everything after that is a blur of hair, sweat, and tossed sheets. The next morning I called Nelson, who, true to form, was answering his number even though it was Saturday. I suppose CIA agents are supposed to give the impression of omnipresence. I gave him part of the story, leaving out the part about us having the remaining dolls, and asked him if he'd check out Hamilton, and done. Nelson sounded disinterested, but he sounds that way even when being shot at, so I didn't attach too much importance to it. He also doesn't often offer compliments, so I was surprised when he said, "It was a good idea for you to call." "Really?" "Yes, you should always check things like this out first. One question. What are you checking it out for?" "What?" I said stupidly, fearing that, as usual, I had made a mistake somewhere. "If you don't have anything to give or to tell these people, why are you checking them out?" "Oh, well, just because they came here to our house and we want to make sure they're on the up and up, you know?" It sounded lame even to me. Nelson paused before he said, "You realize, of course, that like any other citizen, you are required to cooperate in a State Department investigation." "If it really is one," I said, hoping to distract him. And there was another pause before he added, "Of course." There was a smile in his voice. "I'll get back to you, but it may take some time." I thanked him and hung up in the course of our brief and inauspicious association. I've always found it disarming that Nelson seems to know when I'm not being completely candid with him. It doesn't so much make me feel guilty as it makes me feel silly. Peter and I decided that with 2 people dead, we wouldn't wait to hear back from Nelson before we started investigating, but before we headed out, we carried out the task I had set the night before. We renamed the dog. I decided to call him Duffy, because it sounded enough like his former name that I was pretty sure he'd respond to it, and because, though not overly macho, it was at least masculine enough to make the poor animal sound like he had balls. At least, that he was born with them. He was no longer carrying them around. Peter and Mother had allowed me to choose the name out of the misplaced notion that it would help me bond with the animal. He should live so long. That ceremony complete, Peter and I went to work. For once, it was easy for us to know where to start, because in addition to having the rest of the dolls, we knew one other thing that the police didn't. Mason had taken his newest doll to be appraised. We set out for the Old and the Beautiful, the antique shop owned and operated by Marshall Torkelson, the aging queen to whom Mason had brought the new doll for appraisal. Mother decided to stay home because she thought we might get further with Marshall on our own, and because she thought it only right and proper that she stay with the dog on his first day as an official member of our family. I wasn't kidding about the British attitude towards dogs. Peter and I took the L up to Belmont and walked over to Lincoln, having decided not to drive because parking can be a challenge in that particular area. Marshall's shop was about 2 blocks south, and one of those old storefronts with a recessed entrance, across which a huge metal gate is drawn at closing. Despite the large windows in front, the store is so crammed with goods that the interior is perpetually dark. It always reminds me of the old curiosity shop, though Marshall is more like Miss Havisham than Culip. He's a cadaverous, diminutive man who, when I met him, had a frosting of white hair that has become a snowdrift. His cheeks are sunken and his nose falls just short of a beak. His hands are so slender that a mutual friend once remarked that if one ever allowed Marshall to insert a finger into one's orifice, one wouldn't feel a thing. I shuddered at the thought. Marshall wears expensive Italian suits to work, presumably to demonstrate that despite the jumble within the shop's walls, the goods and the proprietor are quality merchandise. There were no customers in the shop when we entered. "Well, well," said Marshall in his reedy voice. "Look who we have here. How are you, my pets, and how is Mother?" He gave us each a discreet peck on the cheek, and I tried not to wince. Marshall has very thin lips, that he puckers like a goldfish when he approaches. "Mother is fine," I said, "and so are we." "Lovely, lovely. You boys are just in time. I have of late taken in the most beautiful oaken sideboard you'd ever hope to see, and I'm sure it would be just the thing for that living room of yours." Peter and I glanced at each other, though we've known Marshall many years. I can't remember him ever being in our home, and apparently neither could my husband, and we already had a sideboard. "Sorry," said Peter, "but actually we didn't come to shop today." "Oh, then to what do I owe the honor of this visit? Surely you didn't just come to see me?" "No," Peter continued. "We came to talk to you because of what happened to Mason Lapierre." "Oh, dear, dear Mason," said Marshall. He clasped his hands just below his chest. I half expected sparks to fly as his bony knuckles clacked against each other. "A tragedy, surely a tragedy." "Yes, it is, and even worse now." "What do you mean?" Marshall's eyes had widened, his hands going to his cheeks. He looked like a gay leprechaun posing for Munch's The Scream. Peter sighed. "I'm afraid Ryan's been killed too." "Oh, no," cried Marshall. Oh, my dear, oh, my dear. Marshall's head rolled backwards, and he flung a hand out in my direction. I caught it as Peter slipped a hand under Marshall's other arm. He was trembling all over, but even though we were supporting him, he seemed to be leading us as he staggered toward a Victorian fainting couch and allowed himself to be lowered onto it. He passed the back of his hand over his forehead and rolled his sunken eyes in my direction. Do you think I have some tea on back there? He waved a limp hand toward the back of the shop. Of course, said Peter, and went to retrieve some. Oh, my dear, said Marshall again, dropping his hands to his sides and vacantly staring straight ahead. This is simply terrible. Do you think... You don't think someone's out to get us all, do you? All homosexuals? Oh, no, I'm sure that's not it, I said. I mean, I don't think it was random. I think someone killed Mason, and Ryan in particular, for a reason that the police can't seem to find at the moment. They can't, said Marshall, sparing enough energy to force a wry smile. That's a surprise. It's early days yet. My dear, dear boy, he said with a condescending smack of his lips. It's always been my experience that the police are blind, deaf, and dumb when it comes to crimes against the daintier males of the species. I didn't respond. I don't know many men, gay or straight, who could be considered dainty. Ryan certainly wasn't. Mason either, for that matter, except for the dolls. Peter arrived with a teacup and saucer, both of which looked as delicate as their owner. He handed them to Marshall, who quickly took a sip, then replaced the cup on the saucer, which he continued to hold very carefully. The tea seemed to calm him a bit. I'm so sorry to give way like that, but it's such a shock. And those two beautiful boys, why, they were like my own, Sons, I offered. He sniffed and glanced at me from the corner of his eye, which had narrowed slightly. Brothers. They were like my own brothers. Oh, God, that they should come to this. He took another sip of tea. We hate to give you the news like this, said Peter, but it couldn't be helped. I had to know sometime, Marshall said with another sniff. It was very kind of you to take the time. That's not exactly why we came, I said. Marshall's eyebrows slid upward into two perfectly rounded crescents that looked out of place on his angular face. I continued. Ryan told us the other day that Mason had brought his new doll to you. Marshall smiled in remembrance. Oh, yes, he loved those dolls, and he had quite a lovely collection. Yes, well, we were wondering if there was anything unusual about the doll. He blinked then, said primly, For what reason? Did he leave them to you? I glanced at Peter. Well, as a matter of fact, he did, but... My God, Marshall interrupted with a dramatic wheeze. They're not even cold in their graves, yet already the vultures are tearing over the spoils. I heard a sigh along with a silent prayer for patience. No, Marshall. Whether or not the dolls were left to me is a very moot point. Most of the dolls were destroyed. My God, he said again, sitting up. Don't say that. What little color there had been drained from his face, leaving the indentions in his cheeks, looking like two triangular smudges. The cup and saucer rattled in his hand. That collection was fabulous. Say it isn't true. I'm afraid it is. Whoever killed Mason smashed most of the dolls for whatever reason. Now, one of the last things that Ryan told us was that Mason had just brought his newest doll to you for your opinion. Oh, yes, he did. It was truly a lovely piece. Not worth any more than Mason paid for it, mind you, but the workmanship was lovely. The type of thing that I predicted would have increased in value manyfold over the passing years. Not that poor Mason would have seen that happen, or even that he even cared. You understand that he just asked me my opinion as a matter of course. He didn't really need it. Like any collector, he developed an eye of his own. He could tell the fruit from the dross, but he wanted a second opinion. The fruit from the dross, I thought to myself. So there was nothing unusual about it? Asked Peter. Oh, not in the least, Marshall replied. He took a couple more sips of tea and laid the cup and saucer on a kidney-shaped coffee table that must have hailed from the 50s. He then added innocuously, Of course, Mason was rather odd about it. How so? Peter asked. Oh, nothing really. It's just that he didn't seem to be as interested as usual in whether or not he'd gotten a good price. Really? Marshall nodded. Yes, he seemed much more interested in the origins of the piece. That was unusual. Oh, yes. He was usually very interested in whether or not he'd gotten a good price. Marshall leaned toward us confidentially. Like most of us boys, he very much liked it when he found he'd gotten a bargain, and he did most of the time. He was a very shrewd collector. But he didn't care about the price. Oh, no. He was much more interested in where it came from. Where was that? Thailand, Marshall said with finality. I would stake my reputation on it. Is there anything unusual about that? Peter asked. Not in the least, Marshall replied airily. But Mason certainly seemed to find it intriguing. He asked me all I knew about it, Thailand, but of course that's next to nothing. I'd never been there, and what do I know of third world countries? Actually, until he said that, I never even thought of Thailand as a third world country. I'd never go any place where one can't be sure of the plumbing, Marshall added. He paused and passed a desiccated hand across his forehead as if the effort of relating this story had almost been too much for him. It completed the picture of a fading Victorian heroine. Dear me, he said with a sigh. You looked the doll over, I asked of her after a pause. Mm-hmm. And you're sure there was nothing different about it? Not outside of it being particularly exquisite. Given where it was made, we tend to think of these people, as being a bit on the unclean side. We do, I said, curling my lip. Peter shot me a warning glance and said, So he just showed you the doll. He didn't show you anything else? Marshall blinked his dewy eyes at us. No, of course not. He only collected dolls. I said, We just thought he might have come across something else and showed it to you? Like what? We don't know. Marshall looked from me to Peter and then back to me. He barely moved his head, although I half expected his neck to creak from the little movement he did use. Now, boys, what are you up to? What do you mean? He tapped the tips of his fingers together. I swear I saw a spark that time. Dropping in here like this, these questions. This is very unlike you. It was more like us than Marshall would ever know, as long as our affiliation with the government remained a secret. Well, to tell you the truth, said Peter, Alex and I feel the same way about the police as you do. They're a bunch of idiots, especially when it comes to crimes against the gay community. So we thought we'd do a little nosing around on our own. Once again, I was a little taken aback at how quickly my husband can come up with stuff like that. It's a talent he shares with my mother, and I find it even more disarming when she does it. But it had the desired effect. Marshall beamed at us like a proud, funny uncle and said, That's wonderful. That's wonderful. My dear boys are being sleuths in arms, and have you gotten anywhere yet? No, we've just started, said Peter. And please don't tell anyone we're doing it. We wouldn't want it to get around. I might keep people from talking to us. Oh, no, Marshall replied, putting his skeletal index finger to his lips. He looked like he enjoyed being part of a conspiracy. I won't breathe a word. Thanks, I intoned. Peter shot me a glance that I don't care to record. Now, you're sure that Mason only showed you the doll? He didn't ask you about anything else? Peter said to Marshall. Oh, yes, I'm sure, Marshall nodded eagerly. If he had something else of value. He didn't show it to me. The moment we were in the door, Mother told us that Margaret Lapierre, Mason's mother, had called to tell us that they had planned to have a memorial service for Mason on Monday evening, but given current events, they had expanded it to include Ryan. Mother had assured her that the three of us would be there. We filled her in on what Marshal Torkelson had said to say. We're no further along, I said. Whatever Mason found in the doll, he didn't show it to Marshall. All he did was ask a lot of questions about Thailand. I was really hoping he had gone to Marshall to get an appraisal of what he'd found. Maybe it was something he couldn't readily have appraised, Mother offered. Like a microdot or something. A microdot, I said incredulously. Mother pursed her lips at me. We have found sillier things in our short, lamented career with the CIA, darling. I was trying to get past the absurdity of having one's mother say something like that when Peter said, I don't think so. Jean, would Mason have recognized something like that, and how would he have found it? Yeah, I added. I would think that with the type of questions he was asking, he had to have some idea that what he found was valuable. I suppose you're right, Mother said with a frown. We were silent for a few moments, each of us lost in our own thoughts. You know, said Mother at last, none of this makes me feel any too easy about having the rest of those dolls here. Come on, Mother. Whoever killed Mason and Ryan must have found what they were looking for. We dismembered what was left of them last night and didn't find a damn thing. Yes, darling, but we don't know what we're looking for. It could be very, very small, for all we know. I shook my head. They must have gotten it when they came back and killed Ryan. Peter said, The State Department seems to think it's still missing. Well, they can't possibly know whether or not the killer got what he was looking for, unless, of course, they're involved somehow, but I don't think that's likely. Oh, yeah, said Peter Riley, folding his arms across his chest. We all know that the government would never have anything to do with murders. Unless, I said, thinking out loud at first. But then an idea came to me. Oh, God, I'm an idiot. Of course. What? Peter and Mother said simultaneously. Whatever Mason found, he didn't leave it in the doll. He hid it somewhere else. But where? Said Mother. The police are sure to have gone over the apartment, and we've gone over what was left of the dolls. Nobody found anything. The three of us exchanged frustrated glances. We were stymied, and we knew it. But it was Mother who finally voiced it. Well, we're at a standstill then. The killer may or may not have found what they were looking for when they came back, but whoever does have it, it's not us. So there's an end to it. Damn, I said, dropping into a chair. I wish to God Mason had told Marshall what the hell he found. He didn't leave us with any trail to follow. We fell silent. I was really upset that we had come to such an abrupt end of our investigation, partly because I felt we owed it to our late friends to try to find out who killed them, and partly because, although I'm embarrassed to admit it, I enjoyed our little brushes with adventure. I once played down the notion that Mother and I are thrill seekers, but as time went on, it was becoming more and more difficult to deny the facts. Peter at least gave the impression of being reluctant to get involved in these escapades, but he always went along nonetheless. Wait a minute, said Mother, breaking the long silence. There is one thing Marshall did tell you that we could follow up, even though I'll admit it's quite a long shot. What? Mason was interested in Thailand. Maybe that's the key. But who knows why he was interested in it, Peter said, forever trying to be the voice of reason. He could have just developed an interest in exotic places. God knows, I never thought I'd see him get interested in Washington, but he did. No, I said, getting at least lukewarm to Mother's idea. He asked Marshall about Thailand only after Marshall told him that that was where the doll came from. I turned to Mother. But I don't see how that gives us anything to follow. Mother shrugged. We could go to the Thai consulate. There's a Thai consulate in Chicago. There are for most countries, Peter said. Mother added with another shrug. Maybe they would know what would be important about one of their imported dolls? Maybe, I said half-heartedly, but that really seems like a long shot. It's an idea, said Mother, and it's the only one we have. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.